A sacred story is not about the past. It's about the eternal now. What makes the text in Luke scripture is its ability to alter our consciousness, to help us see reality differently, to help us see our own life differently, to experience our life more holistically, more in depth. On the surface, this particular sacred story is pretty much straightforward. The literal reading would say that this is another healing story, a healing story that is full of conflict because in this case, Jesus is violating customs and traditions and perceived sacred boundaries. It's the Sabbath, which is a day of rest. And yet Jesus heals a poor woman who's been shamed for over 18 years of what the text refers to as a satanic affliction that causes her to live her life bent over, unable to stand up straight, unable to see right in front of her. But healing is a work. And the religious leader went after Jesus for violating that injunction that you should not work on the Sabbath. In that sense, this is another sacred story that cautions us against judging others. It cautions us against self-righteousness, against thinking that piety is more important than compassion, that rules, the doctrine, trumps mercy. But there are other ways to read this text. There are other ways to receive this as sacred story. There are other ways of awakening and perceiving this story, and other ways to have your own consciousness altered a little bit. I think, for example, that the bent-over woman who enters the synagogue, a woman who is suffering with what we would call osteoporosis, is actually a bent-over church. Now, you might not know what I mean by that. That poor woman, afflicted as she was always bent over, always looking down. She could never stand up straight and tall and see the panoramic scene all around her. A bent-over church is similar. It's overwhelmed with the troubles of the day. Or maybe it's stuck because it's always just looking in the past or perpetually grieving what might have been. A bent-over church doesn't really have a vision of what's next. Bent-over churches don't have a living hope or an excited expectation or a focused belief on where they're going or even why they should bother going at all. A bent-over church is just making sure they don't stumble and completely fall. The spirit of a bent-over church is depressed, and they keep thinking that how it is how it's always going to be. And this past week was a bent-over week in many regards. What began as a necessary and straightforward, actually relatively simple replacement scenario in the education wing of pulling off the heating units, the heating boards, and replacing them, became almost hourly an increasingly complex, unexpected major construction project. A quick and easy replacement of those baseboard heating units became this complex, full-on artery transplant as we encountered an atrophied and dangerous electrical system that was powering those heating units. And it felt like a disaster. It's like finding a leak and then another and another and another, and it never ended. And we were overwhelmed, sucked up every piece of energy in our souls, in our minds, in our bodies. And the more we traced problems, the more problems we found. But what really bent us over wasn't the disaster of the problem. I mean, problems are fixable. What bent us over was our perception that this was just the tip of the iceberg. That our building is old and it's lacked maintenance for years and years, and every quick and easy fix can easily mushroom into a catastrophe. Where does it end? By the end of the week, it was tempting to just look down, as if there was no hope, as if there was no way forward, as if nothing but trouble would rule all of our days. And I imagine the woman felt that way often. And yet she kept going to synagogue. She kept going to hear a word of hope, to experience a group of folks who cared about her, who gave her comfort, who took away the pain of her troubles for at least a while. She continued to show up, to be present in the house of God with the people of God. For 18 long years, she suffered. But then, unexpectedly, it was nothing that she did. Something happened. And she stood up straight again. And she could see with a wide-angle lens again. And of course, she praised God. Something happened that was out of her control. We're a bit like that bent-over woman. It has not been 18 years. But COVID has laid us out as a church since March of 2020, 18 months ago. And we are kind of feeling stuck, just trying to survive, one foot in front of the other. And the pain in our life often feels overwhelming. The fear within our life fill us from time to time with these sudden onrushes of panicked anxiety. How long is this going to last? Like the woman, we have been faithful. Whether it's Sunday at 10 o'clock or at a more convenient time, we're still coming to church, even when we can't see everybody, even when our friendships are distanced. Like the woman, we're still seeking a word of hope and a word of comfort and a connection to something larger than our sufferings, other than our sufferings. A connection to a people that help us understand ourselves. 18 months. This has felt like forever. It is a long, long road that we have been on. And there's even more road to walk. And so it's no wonder that we're bent over. But something happened to that bent over woman. She was touched by Jesus and she could suddenly see anew. And I wonder what it would mean for us to be touched by Jesus, someone that we cannot conjure up on our own or manipulate on our own or even plan for. But what new vision might emerge if we were able to stand up straight and to see with a wide-angle lens and to catch a glimpse of a larger panoramic scenario? What would change in me? What would change in us? In this sacred story, it actually begins with Jesus teaching in the synagogue. It doesn't tell us what he's teaching. Part of standing up straight is to already have a clue as to what is a possible wide-angle view might look like. And just like us, that woman went to synagogue week after week to hear teachings about that view, revealing the actual content of what is God like? How does God act in the world? Why is God worthy of praise and sacrifice? Why is it worth it to endure my own suffering and humiliation? Why is it worth it to have faith? And I think we're the same way. All summer long, week after week, we've been walking with Jesus through the healing stories taught by Luke. We keep hearing a repetition of the wide-angle vision of Jesus, the values of Jesus. We keep repeating the content of his initial missional sermon. The Spirit has anointed me to bring good news to the poor, to proclaim release to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, to release the oppressed, to proclaim God's jubilee. It's all about economic justice, that jubilee is. The end of generational poverty, the end of aristocratic wealth, release and reparations for the slaves. That's pretty wide. And that initial congregation that heard Jesus in Luke 4 there, they received those words, and they received Jesus, and they spoke well of him. They liked that aspirational vision until Jesus put the words into actions. Specifically, until Jesus said that all of these blessings for us are also blessings for them, for our enemies. And that's when the congregation tried to throw Jesus off a cliff. What would you have done if you were there? Actually, you've already proven what you would have done. Several years ago, you felt the power of these words and this vision, this standing up straight, and you turned them into action. You welcomed the homeless step by step into your spiritual home, and it cost you. You had to struggle with angry and uncomfortable neighbors, and you saw it through. But worse, much more difficult, was that you had to struggle with angry and uncomfortable fellow believers, the spiritual family itself. And a lot of people left this church. The pain that is in your heart can bend you over, and did, to the point where many of you lost confidence in your own ability to contribute your talents towards a greater good. And that's what does happen in bent-over churches. Folks begin to hide from each other. They're afraid of each other. In order to get along, the good intention, in order to get along, folks retreat from leadership. They retreat from organizing events. They retreat from participating in group life together. Sometimes folks even stop developing their faith. They simply stay content with a childhood image of God, and they never grow up into adult Christians. And some of this has happened in your history here. The pain created through your acts of courage has wounded you so deeply that the primary value is survival. How do I take another step? It's a bent-over attitude that can no longer see the wide-angle vision of the gospel. It's a bent-over attitude that is too timid to ask with any degree of expectation, what's next? What's next? Back in the day, I remember I used to go into a lot of people's, it was urban. It was an urban environment. I used to go into a lot of urban hotels where people of little or any means lived, and most of the apartments were just utterly and completely trashed. But the nice thing about utterly and completely trashed is You can clean it up. You can change the scenario. You can change the scene. I used to work a lot with homeless kids, and I would talk a lot about homeless kids. And at that time, a fella, he just down the road from you at the Bellevue First Church, and this was a couple of decades ago, David Braun, he saw me at the conference, and I started chirping to him about all the great things that I was doing in my ministry and that the church was doing in its ministry. And David said, well, I have a ministry with street kids. And I looked and I said, yeah? What do you mean? He goes, well, they all drive Beamers, but, they're still street kids. And I laughed, and he laughed, and then he got very focused. And then we had a real conversation of how much more difficult it was for Dave to reach the kids of privilege, because there's so many defenses you have to go through to get there. And it's actually relatively easy when somebody's hungry to feed them. But when their heart has atrophied, that's hard work. Now, I'm not saying any of this to put our church down, and I'm certainly not wanting to add any weight onto an already pretty full backpack. I'm actually trying to say the opposite. I think this is a great church. I think it is full of generous and kind-hearted and savvy and courageous people, proven courageous people, who not only know what the gospel is, but they have allowed Jesus to touch them in the past. What I am saying is that was then, and this is now. There's a future for this church, but it won't happen if folks hide their giftedness from each other. There's a post-COVID world emerging, and it's going to require the building and shaping of people with soul, people who are no longer hollowed out by fatigue. God is and has always been in the deeps, but life is increasingly being lived in the shallows just to get by. Where are the communities that help us build this inner core, our interior life, building them in such a way that we become strong and clear and courageous in our inclusion of the oppressed and the captive and the blind and the form and the victimized in all of their forms? Strong enough and clear enough and courageous enough to allow Jesus' gospel to touch us again, to straighten our backs again, to heal us, and to heal us of all those hurts that we have been carrying around in this church for well over 18 years. And all of those fears and all of those wounds that we have carried for far, far too long. A sacred story is not about the past. It's about the eternal now. And what makes this text in Luke scripture is in its ability to alter our consciousness and to help us see reality differently and to experience life more holistically, more in depth. And the woman, when she was healed, she stood up straight and began praising God. And the entire crowd was rejoicing in all of the wonderful things that Jesus was doing. It's our time now.